It's considered one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed.
What the court did today is say it's outdated.
It was a total unawareness of the existence of prejudice in the United States.
We'd worked so hard, we'd struggled so long, people had lost their lives for this, and bam, it's taken away just like that.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
If we're going to do anything that's worthwhile, we've got to go for the vote.
That's a revolutionary act in Mississippi.
They didn't like integration, didn't like the vote, they didn't like niggas.
The voting was absolutely dangerous business.
That was the big fear of white folks, to vote.
They were fighting for their dear life, their way of life.
We are going to see to it that law and order is maintained, and maintained Mississippi style.
You could go missing, and no one would ever find you.
Republican was a synonym for Yankee. Republicans were the party of Lincoln.
As black voters were flocking in increasing numbers to the Democratic Party, white voters would flock in increasing numbers to the Republican Party.
Parties switched places.
They recognized that they could use race to win.
That's commonly called playing the race card.
Don't play the race card.
A new bill has been introduced in the North Carolina Senate requiring North Carolinians to present an ID when they go to vote.
These are not dumb Southerners wanting to get those black people.
It has nothing to do with race.
Of course it's race. How can you say it's anything else?
We have marched, we have lobbied, we have advocated, we've gone to the hearings. We said, no, we have to go to the next level.
Do you think we're going to allow any group of politicians to suppress the right to vote? You must be out of your doggone mind.
Mr. Trump has again repeated the unproven claim that millions of illegal votes were cast in the last election.
None of them come to me. They would all be for the other side.
Where is the evidence of that?
The President of the United States is correct 100%.
There's nothing to do with voter fraud. Nothing to do with voter fraud.
Do we have to fight these battles all over again?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to One State, One Film. I'm the moderator for tonight's event, Andrew Clark from the IMRP at Central Connecticut State University, and it's a pleasure to have our panelists tonight and for everyone to be participating in this. We call this One State, One Film, and One State, One Film is a series dedicated to exploring the intersection of race with different aspects of the American life. Sponsored by the Connecticut Collaborative on Poverty, Criminal Justice, and Race, the films will cover the criminal justice system, voting access, and other topics where racism most acutely impacts people of color. Panel discussions will help participants learn what they can do to combat racial injustice. As you know, for those who are here, participants will view the films selected as part of the series on their own. And luckily, I believe Gavin, actually, if you haven't been able to see it prior to now, will be able to provide the link for a few days after to watch it for free. Then we, like we are tonight, are hosting a virtual panel discussion with experts who have worked to address these issues of racial justice. Participants will join the conversation to learn what they can do to make positive, tangible change in their communities. And I'd like to mention that we'd appreciate it if everyone fills out a survey form at the end of tonight's discussion so we can make future programs even better. And that survey form will be shared by Richard Frieder, I believe, from the Collaborative. And we did receive multiple responses from the last survey. And one of the things that we found out is that we have to turn on the chat so that everybody can talk to each other. So we would like you to do that. It's open for everyone to be able to communicate with each other. The Q&A is for if you have questions for later on. We're going to have the moderated panel discussion first, and then later on at approximately, let's see, where are we, 7:35, I believe we will go into 43. We'll start taking questions from the audience. So please do put questions there as they arise. And we'll sort through those and get to the ones that we can. So who is the Collaborative on Poverty, Criminal Justice, and Race? Well, We're a coalition of organizations and individuals working at the intersection of the issues of poverty, criminal justice, and race throughout Connecticut. You can find out more about us at ctcollaborative.org, as well as the One State, One Film series. There will be a resource sheet that we'll make available later tonight for everyone, as well as the survey I mentioned. Okay, so this is the second film in our series. The first, if folks that are on were able to witness that, that was a tremendous conversation that focused on Just Mercy, the story of Brian Stevenson. And we had Naisha from our collaborative who was moderating, and it was a tremendous discussion about the issues of mainly the prison system and the work that Brian Stevenson has been doing through the Equal Justice Initiative. Tonight, we're focusing on Let the People Decide. Why did we choose this? Well, it was actually inspired through a friend, a fellow named Andy Friedland from the Anti-Defamation League here in Connecticut, and they had actually, we work with him in the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force in Connecticut, and just in a random conversation with him, he said, you have to watch this film. And he actually shared a link with me, which I was able to see most of it, and it blew me away, frankly. And I got in touch with Gavin as we were in the midst of planning all this. And Gavin, who is the writer, producer, director of the film, I think responded, Gavin, probably in about a minute after I reached out to him. He's just so engaged in this issue and so approachable. Tonight he texted me that he's going to get on at 6:55 because he's on another panel on the topic. And as you know, if you watch the movie, it's very timely for the moment we're facing here in Connecticut and across the country. So one of the things, you know, the themes that resonate through Let the People Decide are the history of the struggle for civil rights, you know, contested elections, and the issues of who can vote. You know, those are things that we talk about nationally, but also here in Connecticut. And we're going to be later on in the conversation talking about that relative to the prison system. And, you know, there's also, I think, you know, the recent, protests after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And one thing that I can say is that, you know, I grew up in Connecticut here in the suburbs, and a lot of people see that in a vacuum, and they see it just relative to the police and vehicle stops and things that have been happening in the past 5 years. And I think, as you can see from this film, that at least in the time that the film covers, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And there's a lot that goes into the struggle for civil rights in our society. So before we begin the conversation, I have the pleasure to introduce Kelvin Young. He's also a member of the collaborative, and he's a community health worker at the Intercommunity Healthcare in Hartford, and is a certified sound healer. And he's also a person in sustained recovery, which means he hasn't used drug or alcohol to cope with his mental and emotional distress since March 6, 2009. And the first time he was exposed to sound healing, Kelvin discovered the sounds of the crystal and Tibetan singing bowls and gongs, and calmed his mind, relaxed his body, and nourished his soul. And we would like to thank Kelvin for bringing his talents here tonight. And I think everyone will find, as we did in the last event, that it's just a tremendous way to calm ourselves before, I'm sure, what will be a very engaging, sometimes troubling, and hopefully meaningful and productive conversation. So Kelvin?
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that warm introduction. And, you know, I really believe, and before we get into these very intense conversations, discussions, I had opportunity to watch Gavin's documentary, and it was so powerful, so moving, and a lot of emotions came up for me. So I believe it's important for us to take a few minutes to check in with ourselves, notice our thoughts or any physical sensations within our bodies, or any raw human emotion that may come up within us. This sacred check-in allows us the opportunity to notice where we're at mentally, emotionally, spiritually, as well as physically. It allows us to center ourselves into the present moment, but it also allows us to set our intention for our panel discussion here tonight. So at this moment, I invite you to get into a comfortable seated position, whatever that means for you. And I also invite you to either close your eyes or bring a soft gaze to the floor. Whatever feels most comfortable and safe for you, I invite you to do so at this moment. As we take this opportunity to check in with ourselves, connect with our emotions, connect with our bodies, connect with our thoughts, as we take these few moments to simply just be. As we take a few minutes to relieve stress, find inner peace and balance through the transformative powers of sound. I now invite each and every one of us to take a nice deep breath in and a long breath out. We'll do this 2 more times. Take a nice deep breath in and a long breath out. One more time. Take a nice deep breath in and a long breath out. And at this moment, I invite you to bring your focus, your awareness, and your attention to the sounds you will hear in the comfort of your sacred space. And if your mind happens to drift away to that infamous to-do list, or all the text messages and emails you need to respond back to, or any other stressors or responsibilities that you have in your life, I invite you to gently bring your focus back to the sounds. Allow the sounds to be your anchor into the present moment. Allow it to be a gentle reminder to each and every one of us that the only time that we truly have on this journey that we call life is now. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Kelvin. Really appreciate that, especially after a long day. Okay, so to the conversation. Let me just start with a brief synopsis of Let the People Decide. As those of you hopefully have seen the movie, we saw the clip, but essentially since the founding of this country, who gets to vote has been a contested issue. In 2013, a controversial Supreme Court ruling that gutted the Voting Rights Act further inflamed the issue, as photo ID requirements and other strict voting regulations spread to many states. Many argue that these states are cynically trying to circumvent federal protections and prevent minorities from voting, while others insist that these new laws are common sense regulations designed to protect the integrity of elections. These arguments serve to highlight the struggle that was waged to gain the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In the southern states of the US, the fight over voter registration came to a head over a 4-year period from 1961 to 65. In that time, there were beatings, bombings, protest marches, mass jailings, and murder. Once the Voting Rights Act was signed, it was not the end of the struggle over voting, but the opening of a new front in a battle to attain and retain power. As you have seen, Let the People Decide connects the dots across generations to illustrate how events from over 50 years ago are still reverberating in today's heated political climate. All right, so for tonight's panel, I'd like to break up the discussion in two parts, one about the film and its national relevance and the historical relevance, and the second, bring it close to us in our state here and how it relates to the issues we face in Connecticut today. So first, I'd like to bring on two individuals directly involved in the film we are discussing tonight, and we are delighted to have with us Gavin Guerra and David Dennis. Now, Gavin is the writer, director, and producer of the film and is a graduate of Parsons School of Design and has worked creating computer-generated visual effects for film and TV for over 28 years, as well as teaching those skills at the university level for 20 years. And since 2013, he's been making a documentary film on the history of voting rights in the US as relates to the race, and is currently producing the new space show for the Hayden Planetarium at the American Museum of Natural History. And David, Mr. Dennis, has been a civil rights activist since the 1960s. He grew up in the segregated area of Omega, Louisiana, and worked as a co-director on the Council of Federated Organizations, as director of Mississippi's Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and as one of the organizers of the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. All right, so this documentary is broken up into 3 acts. And Act 1 is the 1960 modern civil rights movement. In Greenville, North Carolina, and we see sit-ins. We harken back to John Lewis, was actually one of the motivating factors, his death, and why we chose to do this film, and Ella Baker and others, including Bob Moses. Gavin, I have a question. In the process of deciding which dot to start with, when you're talking about connecting the dots, why did you start here?
So that's a valid question. So I really felt a lot of there's so much in that time frame and in that era. What I really wanted to do is I wanted to sort of narrow my focus as much as possible, and I felt that Mississippi in the South in the 1960s was a great sort of proxy for the entire civil rights movement. Rather than jump around and chase every act of violence or protest from Atlanta to Alabama to Mississippi to Florida, I really wanted to be able to dive deep into the story. So Mississippi offered that. However, once I started there and I started talking about SNCC and CORE and things like that, there was no context for that. So I had to go back a little bit further and what is SNCC? How was it formed? Who was Ella Baker? What are the sit-ins? What was that? That was the sort of the first shot in the student movement, right? So those young men at a North Carolina A&T sitting in at the Woolworth counter really caused quite a stir, and people took notice of the energy and the youth that they, the youth and the energy that they brought to the movement. And so, Dr. King and his cohort were trying to channel that energy, right? So Ella Baker is the one who was Dr. King's, she basically ran the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She's the one who brought the students together and formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, not as a youth wing of Dr. King's movement, but as an individual entity that they could really make change and channel their own energy towards greater good. So I felt that from a contextual level, even though direct action, which the sit-ins and freedom rides are commonly called, isn't voter registration, and there was a little bit of a tension between those two movements, between voter registration and direct action, that in order to properly give context to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and later on Freedom Summer, you sort of had to know from where that came. So that's why that was the first dot in the chain.
Thank you. And you mentioned youth, and I know that theme resonates throughout and comes back in Act 3 when we talk about the youth and the NAACP and some of the colleges there that got involved in North Carolina. I want to take us back to David Dennis's youth. I mentioned in a conversation with Dennis prior to this starting that actually worked for Bill Dyson, who's fairly well known in our state, who also is 80 years old and grew up in the segregated South in Waycross, Georgia. And I had a lengthy conversation with him last night, as we still keep in touch, because I always find it fascinating and disturbing and everything else, emotion thrown in there, just listening about those times. So, Mr. Dennis, would you be willing to take us back to the 1960s and what it was like to grow up in the segregated area of Omega, Louisiana, and what motivated you to join the fight for voting rights?
First of all, I want to thank Kevin for this introductory pieces. He's of mine. We have a person who was working with us for a long time. I was a professor at Virginia State University. And so he used to carry us through this type of exercise before meetings, during meetings, workshops and stuff. And he just passed away a couple of months ago. So it sort of brought me back to that. And also, Gavin, of course, was a great film, and enjoyed watching it every time I see it. And looking at the trailer, I've looked at all of the people in the trailer, even Patterson, I've had some connection with them in one way or the others, and some of them are not here. And that's the sad part of that. We lost quite a number of people over the past couple of years that was involved in the movement. So I just want to mention that first, because it has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about. And part of my youth grew up, segregation was a way of life. I came up at northern Louisiana was really one of the most violent areas in the country. You can talk about Mississippi, Alabama. Well, up around that northern Louisiana, Shreveport, place where I was raised, was people that was like something was a way of life. Was death, lynchings, and beatings, and things of that nature. So when I grew up at that type of a fear of being protected by family, being a part of a sharecroppers family, and then moving into the city of Shreveport later on. That's the way I grew up. I got up in the morning when I did go to school. I had to go on a bus and across town, and because I went to a Catholic school. And getting on that bus you had to walk and ride in the back of the bus, passing segregated places, water fountains, and you go to a classroom. And the first thing you did in the morning was to pledge allegiance to the flag and sang the national anthem. And then in the evening, you go back and get on that bus, and you go through the same exercise every day of your life. So being able as a way of life, it's already bred into. So a lot of people ask me, well, what did you think about what happened to you when Emmett Till was murdered? Well, it wasn't like a surprise. It wasn't like a real shock to me. But what the men did in our neighborhood was to take all the black boys and said, this is what you have to do to avoid ending up like that. So we were taught that you saw a white woman walking down the street, you cross the street. You don't look them in the eye, you don't face them, you don't say anything to them. If you did, you say yes them, and you keep walking. So that was called a piece of it. So I didn't grow up with a whole thing about fighting for freedom kind of stuff. It was really fighting for survival. And I relate that type of life as to what a lot of kids are going through today in a different way. So really I didn't have my introduction to the civil rights movement was actually what I call most of my fate, the fate of God, the largest that is, because I went to finish high school in Baton Rouge. My best friend and classmate was a guy by the name of Rap Brown. When the students walked out of Southern University in 1960, we graduated from high school. And so his brother was leading a march from Southern University, the largest walkout in civil rights history in universities. And so he wanted to join. We didn't join. We went to his house and played basketball. I really got involved in the movement when I got into, went to New Orleans at Dillard University. I got lucky enough to get a scholarship because when I graduated from high school, I was the first in my family to graduate from high school. So getting to college was like a miracle. And so the kids were demonstrating and involved them, and some of the kids were in jail. And I really got to my first taste of the movement was trying to get a date with a young lady who was speaking on the campus, Doris Castle, who was the sister of Aretha Castle, who was a civil rights icon out of New Orleans. And so that was my whole piece in that. Is I went to this meeting, was at Mount Zion Baptist Church, which was a core meeting, and was an old gentleman there who was leading the meeting by the name of Jim McCain, who was from Sumter, South Carolina, who worked for CORE. And so that was my introduction. So to make a long story short, it's getting involved. And so I really didn't, when I say act of fate, I got in jail, put in a sit-in, trying to still get a date with this young lady who wouldn't date me unless I did something radical. Mm-hmm. I went on a demonstration, I got arrested, and by accident. And so, because I wasn't supposed to get arrested. That day the cops were tired of it, so they put us in jail.
It's a fascinating story. It reminds me of talking to Mr. Dyson, because that's how he got involved in the sit-ins, was through his experience at Morris College. And it also reminds me of him when he says, when you meet someone, talk to them, get to know them.
That's right.
Because you never know the stories that you can find out in the history about our country and the like, just through a simple conversation. And hearing that is just amazing to me. And so here we have in the film bringing to life the early 60s that you were just talking about. And here comes the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964. And on June 21st, Schwimmer, Cheney, and Goodman are murdered, as we see in the film, as on their way to assist the registering of blacks in Neshoba County. And you're right in the thick of it. And when we were talking about who would be able to come on the panel, Gavin mentioned you. And then he said, you got to take a look at PBS, The American Experience, and the Freedom Summer clip, which I wasn't aware of, and I did. And a little clip of this, it says, when you gave the eulogy at the funeral of James Cheney, who was killed along, which I mentioned, with Schwimmer and Goodman, some implored you to make your speech quiet and low key, but you recalled looking at those gathered in the church and seeing Ben Cheney, James' little brother, and you lost it. You totally just lost it, you said. Instead of a low key eulogy, you pled with those who gathered, don't bow down anymore. Hold your heads up. We want our freedom now. I don't want to go to another memorial. I'm tired of funerals. I'm tired of it. We've got to stand up. What were you feeling at that moment?
Well, that was a real transition in my life, is from being nonviolent and to, I was really at the crossroads of saying is that eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I was with Medgar Evers the year before, 1 hour before he was assassinated. He was a very good friend of mine. I was with Cheney Goodman Swerner the night before they were killed. And what a lot of people don't know about is, by accident, I was with my best friend, David Baldwin, James Baldwin's brother, on the second night of the Harlem riots in New York. And we were there, and I was there when a kid was just shot down right in front of us. So what happened at that time is, in the leading up to the eulogy and what was going on during that period, during the period of time of the three people were missing, there were two things going on that really was getting to me. One was they were finding bodies throughout the state of Mississippi. And the whole country was like, when they found out it wasn't one of the three missing civil rights workers, it was like a sigh of relief. Well, you know, whew, it wasn't them. Maybe they're still alive. And I'm like, wait a minute, you finding black bodies, you know, in the rivers, you're finding black bodies in the side of the road. What are we talking about here, you know? So all of this stuff is beginning to just well up into, and then the understanding of the fact is that really were they there looking for, if it's just been Cheney, three black kids, would they be doing this? Would this country be that upset about what was going on and looking for it? Or was it because of the fact that two of the three people missing were these two white people, of whom I loved? But so all of that sort of welled up with me. And in addition to that is, so all of that sort of came down at that moment there is. And so that transition of the piece is, I think if somebody on that particular day has said, here's a gun or here's a way out of this thing to deal with this, I probably would have taken that road. Lucky it didn't happen. But I just had an anger. And you know, just really, it was like the end of the road. And then that just built up, leading on into the challenge of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And when we lost that I was just really shut down mentally, you know, and emotionally and everything else is. So that was what's going on at that time, at that particular moment. It's just all it's like the whole church became, you know, it was like blood, people, you know, all you could see was people dying. And it was one of the most horrific times of my life.
You had said you didn't even remember what you said for like a week.
That's correct. I did not know. In fact, it was about a year or so more before I ever listened to the speech. I couldn't do that, you know, and so I didn't know what I said. I had some notes written down and stuff like that, but I threw them away because I was being talked to by a lot of different people by how to cool it down because they didn't want to get the country upset, you know, and they say we want to have a nice quiet funeral. And it didn't make sense to me.
Yeah. And so you mentioned about if it was just some poor black boys that the country wouldn't have paid attention. And in the movie, Gavin, you put in President Lyndon Johnson when he signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, after these struggles that you document in the film, saying their cause must be our cause. So it did have an impact. And one of the things that is mentioned in there in the film was the 100 Yale students that came down. And we have with us today Zal Shroff, who I want to bring in now, who's a clinical lecturer in law and a senior Liman fellow in residence at Yale Law School. At the Liman Center, he supervises students working on projects related to criminal justice reform and co-teaches the Liman workshop. And previously, he worked for 2 years as a staff attorney and civil rights litigator at the ACLU of Kansas. And Zal, I think you saw the film and you probably noted that, I imagine, that comment about the Yale students coming in. What'd you think when you saw that? Had you known about that? And is there anything that you'd like to ask Mr. Dennis or Gavin about the film?
You know, no, I hadn't known that. I thought it was an interesting thing. And an interesting thing for this moment to think through who leads movements and how allies fit in. And I think, thinking through that strategy and making sure that the voices of people who are impacted are still predominating, even though you can use allyship in a strategic way. I think it's a super important thing for us to grapple with now. And I guess, where I come in is sort of maybe more the end of the film with the litigation in North Carolina, thinking through some of the contemporary issues with voting and how you sort of ferret out things that are clearly designed to suppress the vote, but don't have the same sort of overtly racist message that is as easy to pinpoint. You have to sort of look for it more closely. And so I guess I'd be curious about what folks think about that sort of transition and how we can really continue to activate outrage and clarify exactly what voter suppression is as we're shifting in sort of a in time.
So you brought up an interesting point at the beginning there, which was the oppressed voices still having a voice or still being represented, and I didn't really put that in my film, honestly, but it was a big deal, and Dave can speak to this, is that there was a little bit of friction between the locals and the organizers over Freedom Summer, over who wanted to run Freedom Summer, who wanted to bring these white kids down from the north and sort of take over, right? Because they were literally organizing, poor young Black people to give them a voice and to really kind of take the lead. And they didn't necessarily want these rich white kids coming down and all of a sudden they're in the back seat, right? And there was quite a bit of struggle over that. And Bob Moses, who's featured heavily in the film, put an end to that discussion when Lewis Allen was murdered. And he's not a loud person. If you've ever talked to Bob, you almost don't even know he's in the room half the time, but his words when he does speak carry a lot of weight. And he said, we're doing this. Like he was, like Dave was saying about this sort of collection of bodies, right? Bob felt a lot of responsibility for these bodies, right? That these were, like, if he wasn't there and he wasn't stirring the pot, these people would still likely be alive doing exactly what Dave was talking about, where like just crossing the street, don't make eye contact, right? Like that way of life was ingrained. And here comes this guy who's shaking things up and now people are dying, right? And so he felt that we needed to have that big push, and that bringing these white kids down would open Mississippi up to the rest of the country. And that was not an easy decision to come to, knowing that these kids would be putting themselves in harm's way, right? And they were kind of, delicately put, they were kind of bait, right? To a certain degree, like, like Dave said, if it was 3 Black kids who were missing, nobody would have cared, right? Rita Schwerner, who was the wife of Mickey Schwerner, while they were looking, she was saying that, like, it's a real shame that it takes 2 missing white people to go look for 1 Black person, right? So that's a thing. To your other point, I think that organizing youth is interesting because it's, we're speaking with Dave here, who just celebrated his 80th birthday, but he was a very young man when this happened, right? All these people that we're seeing in this film, they were all college kids for the most part, right? They were all teenagers in their in their early 20s. And I think that the lesson we learn from, the George Floyd protests and the youth wing of the civil rights movement is that pressure works. I mean, pressure moves the needle, and that, they're not going to, if they keep the pressure on, people will move the discussion towards what they're talking about, be it voter suppression or institutional racism or police reform or anything of that nature. there's a guy in the film who's one of the young activists who says the wisdom of the elders with the energy of the youth is what keeps the movement going, you know. And so,
I had that written down as well. And so that, I guess we could skip ahead a little bit, that because Zal, you mentioned the essentially the third act in North Carolina in the Moral Monday movement. And you have John in 2013, John Roberts, who's the same guy who worked in the DOJ Civil Rights Division under Reagan. A mere 20 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, he's actively in an administration working against it. And in 2013, Shelby versus Holder striking down Section 5 of the Act and saying, which apparently he probably felt in the 80s too, today the nation is no longer divided along those lines, yet the Voting Rights Act continues to treat it as if it were. And you have the bishop there talking about the fusion movement and taking the moral and economic and ethical and human arguments back for justice. And you have the young student there talking about it started with only 50 or 60 people. And Dave, is that how it felt like when you were starting? Was it just a few people in the room and you were wondering, how are you going to get an army behind you to take on this massive mountain?
Well, it was a question of how you're going to move people, because it was a small group. The movement's made up of a small group of people who were riding on the backs of a larger number of people who saw like the hidden numbers. What had happened is, what I learned very young in the civil rights movement, that there was a movement already in the Black community throughout the South. And it was primarily led by the NAACP groups of kids, young people and elders. So these elders, they were a mixture of people they were businessmen, there were landowners, there were sharecroppers, and there were three groups of people at the time that came out of whereby they were more independent Black people. That was the porters from the railroad. That was the postal workers. And the third group of people were longshoremen. So under these groups of people is that joined together, put together a movement, and they were focusing primarily on registered to vote and on education in the South. So when we got into the movement pieces, what really laid another type of groundwork, another stage of the movement were the freedom rides. So when we came out into the movement struggle, everybody, no matter who you were, where you were, what you came for, your organizations, if you out there talking about taking some kind of action, whether it's voter registration or sit-ins, whatever it is, you were known as a freedom ride. But in addition to that is, we had in the Black community this strong family connection, the extended family pieces. So we also were like still the children of the community. That's how I grew up. I was a child of the community, not just by biological parents. So the movement people is the reason why we were able to, we brought in 1,000 people in 1964, and the community just absorbed them, just took them in, and they just disappeared into the different places throughout the South, and especially Mississippi. And that was very, about the heroes of the movement, these to me were the heroes, because when we left, those people had to stay there. But they didn't mind it at that time. They risked their lives on a daily basis. They knew what they were going to be in for. They knew what the repercussions were going to be for what they did is. At the same time, they opened the doors and they embraced those people who were in the civil rights movement. So that's what really made it possible for us, for young people to be able to do what we were able to do, core SNCC people, or there happened to be this underground movement of people in the Black community throughout the South who sort of really embraced, protected us. They fed us because we didn't have any money, $25 a week to live off of, you know. And so they've embraced us and made it. And one of the things about just to register, to attempt to register to vote at that time, I mean, that was a life-threatening situation. That is, you could lose your life. And so one of the things is, very shortly as I say, is that I'll never forget, it was in Canton, Mississippi, we used to have these voter registration days, and on Fridays we call Freedom Vote Day. And so we try to get people, as many people as possibly could, to come down to try to register to vote. And I'll never forget one day this old couple came in this mule and a wagon. And they drove up to the Canton, rolled up to the Canton courthouse. The old gentleman got out and he tipped his hat and he helped his wife down. And she had an old bonnet on. And they walked up and they said, "Where do I go to vote for George Raymond?" He had a mixed up, confused. George Raymond was a field secretary for Corps at the time. We told me that it's not a voting day, it's what you call the register. So where can I go to do that? Then can I vote for George Raymond? So we said, yeah. So he went up. He walked right up there to he and his wife between the sheriff, the deputies, and all those white folks who were lined up there. He looked them straight in the eye, which is unusual, and walked up, attempted to register the vote, and of course they didn't allow him to. And he walked down very slowly. And he got helped his wife on the wagon. He got that wagon, and he tipped his hat. He said, "Thank you, sir." And he turned around in that mule. And it's all I can, it was the clip of the clop as he left. I still dream about that because I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happened to all the hundreds of thousands of people who fed us, who opened their doors in the movement days. So when I look at that, what happened then and how the struggle was for that right to vote, and we come to where we are today is, I mean, it's heartbreaking and it hurts. But at the same time, what it says to me more than anything else is we've got to roll up our sleeves because we're in a surge back. And in order to make that surge forward, we got a whole lot of work to do. So instead of complaining about this, if we do win this election, getting the right, it's more than just the right to vote. We've got to think about how to organize. We need to be running for every office from dog catcher all the way up to mayors and whatever you have is Congress, whatever we have, every elected position. So that's what we didn't do in the past is, I mean, what Gavin's film depicts is what really happened and how the white community and the racists began to organize right after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed in 64 and 65 and began to systematically resegregate this country to make that surge back to where we are now. It's not something that happened overnight. It's been going on since 1964, 65.
Yeah, it's just amazing to hear that. And the more that you're immersed in this and it brings me back to that quote in the movie, power concedes nothing without a struggle. And you think about the kind of the two sides, if we're going to give it a two-sided equation. And one is talking about their life and just the struggle to register and how you were talking about not having enough money to be able to feed yourself and worrying about that couple that you just mentioned. And the other side, it just makes you wonder, like, what is the huge worry there other than power? And so we go back to Act Two, the Southern strategy. You have Governor George Wallace and Barry Goldwater, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. You know, this stuff translates into code, states' rights against big government, law and order. You see that with Nixon. Goldwater loses in a landslide, but then Nixon uses it to his advantage. And I saw a fascinating documentary on PBS about Ohio and Kent State and how the police there and how Nixon used that as a law and order campaign after that. And then you see in the movie, we come back to Reagan kicking off his campaign in Neshoba County where Goodman, Cheney, and Schwermer were murdered. And what is his slogan? It's "Make America Great Again." And you know, can we talk about the coded language that is a part of this effort to suppress the vote even today? I mean, you had Amy Coney Barrett, who just got sworn into the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts, each worked on the Republican side of Bush v. Gore. It makes it all seem, in this film does such a fascinating way of putting it all together, is though voting rights is the central issue and everything else is secondary. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about even President Trump, and I'm not even sure he's aware of what he's involved in. You know, it almost seems like has a mouthpiece for it, but not necessarily aware of all of this history. So anybody want to reflect on that?
Well, Zal's on the front lines, right? So he's doing litigation, but from a broad point of view, I mean, the idea, and I cut the whole gerrymandering section out of my film because it was its own movie. I mean, it is its own movie, quite frankly. But the idea that politicians would rather pick their voters than let voters pick their politicians, right? So they are Julian Bond said, so in that same thing about safe seats, I mean, every politician likes a safe seat, right? They all want their jobs. So Julian Bond said he was involved in that too. Like, yeah, he drew a safe district for himself in Georgia. I mean, no politician is above that, okay? So when they see these demographics shifting, when you see a shrinking Republican Party and an expanding independent or Democratic Party, that's existential to them, right? And so they are going to enact policy that favors them. And we, you know, that the whole Florida felon disenfranchisement thing and putting that poll tax in because they want to keep those people from voting against them. Or in my film, it's the voter ID argument, right? Which is, who does this affect and who are they likely to vote for? Because in North Carolina, 95% of African Americans vote Democrat, right? So I have this on tape. I didn't put it in the movie because it was part of the gerrymandering part, but there is a state legislature who was just recently arrested for embezzlement, which is an aside, but he was in charge of drawing the district maps, and these maps kept getting thrown out, right? They just one after another, they kept getting thrown out because they were racialized. They had disparate impact to the minority community. So he'd go back and draw it again, except his mind was exploding because you can't draw a partisan map in North Carolina without it being a racial map because all the minorities are on the Democratic side. So he had this real catch-22 he was in. So he's in this meeting and he gets on the microphone and he says, this map is designed for partisan advantage. It has nothing to do with race. It's only for partisan advantage. So this African-American lawmaker says, well, we just had an election and we got half the vote and you got half the vote. How come you set it up so that you got 10 districts and we got 3? The guy said, the reason we drew a map that was 10-3 in our favor is I couldn't figure out a way to make it 11-2. Right? I mean, they're really that dug in, okay? And so I think that when you get into these questions of race and politics and the coded language, which, mind you, now today is less coded, right? I think that's something that Trump has brought to the table. It's kind of more of a bullhorn than a dog whistle, but it gives people cover, right? That language gives people cover, and I think one of the key moments in the film, if I can just say, was Bob Moses at the end of Act 1, when those sheriffs who were arrested for the murder of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were getting arraigned, and they were sort of having a party at the arraignment, right? And everyone was laughing and having a good time. And the country saw that picture in Life magazine, and Bob said, they can look at that picture and feel better about themselves, right? That's not us. Those are racists. We're not racist, right? And I think what the George Floyd stuff did is the same argument, right? You can look at that cop murdering that guy and say, that's not us, right? That's you know, those are bad people. I'm a good person. Except the difference today is that we're having that difficult discussion about systemic racism and white privilege that the country wasn't willing to have in 1964.
Thanks, Gavin. And it's a great segue. And I just do want to remind folks to throw any questions into the Q&A. It's a perfect segue. And Mr. Dennis, I'd love to bring you in as well, because you talked about the movement must continue. And, you know, Gavin, you live in Connecticut now. Zal, you left Kansas and now you're with us at Yale. And, you know, I think having grown up in Connecticut again, we like to believe, especially in the suburban communities, that we're void of such oppression and overt attempts at discrimination. And yet, as Zal knows, when you look in certain areas, you can find it and pretty readily. And one of the areas that we've been focused on through work with the Sentencing Commission, the Connecticut Reentry Collaborative, and the Collaborative on Race, Criminal Justice, and Poverty is prisons. And, you know, there's a tremendous a magazine online called the Marshall Project that I would point anybody to read up about things about prison. And I think they mentioned, if I get the stats right, there's over, I think 700,000 people across the US in jails that are eligible to vote. And yet they don't. And why is that? And maybe, Zal, you can give us a little bit of a, you know, a piece of what you're working on and why it is you're working on it, and some of the things, so that, you know, folks here in Connecticut can say, well, maybe I'm not going to go down to Mississippi, or with COVID and everything going on, the traveling's not, but there's stuff that you can point to here in Connecticut. And maybe Mr. Dennis, you can help us think about this movement.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that. So I think Gavin hit it right on the head, which is, you know, I think there's a tendency, especially for folks on the East Coast, to say, oh, you know, this is not us. You know, we don't have these issues. So I'm coming from Kansas, which is a state that has, I would say, overt suppression in mind, where there was a documentary proof of citizenship law that disenfranchised 30,000 voters. Those were clearly and predominantly young Black and brown voters. We had a situation there where, you know, every year 30,000 votes are tossed for technicalities, and voters are never informed that their ballot didn't count. As a result of litigation, you now have the right to find out, and anyone can find out whose ballots were tossed and why those were tossed in a way that has never been possible before. So, you know, I think coming from that context where you can see how the system is designed to intentionally suppress votes, and then coming to Connecticut, which, you know, I had imagined would be a radically different environment. It's certainly culturally a very different environment around voting. And yet I think you see some of the same problems. And so it's interesting to then take the sort of the morality and the intent a little bit out of the equation, and then look at what bureaucratic intransigence does to suppress the right to vote. And then also to look at sort of the disconnect between what people's words are and what their actions are. So, you know, I'm focusing right now in particular on guaranteeing the right to ballot access in jails in Connecticut. And I think it's really a good sort of case study in the fact that, like, everyone says they have a right to vote, or rather the, you know, Constitution says we have a right to vote. And what's the relationship between that right to vote and our actual access to the ballot? And that has everything to do with whether the government is actually giving us access or not. So,
and just to step in there real quickly, Zal, I think people would be surprised to know, because in Connecticut in the past several legislative sessions, there's been bills for to allow people, you know, the right to vote who are on parole. They allowed people the right to vote who are on probation. There's certain places in the country that took away the right if you had a felony conviction for life. And yet in Connecticut, they've never taken away the right to vote if you have a misdemeanor conviction and you're incarcerated, or when you're serving time pre-trial. And yet that's something, as someone who's worked in the criminal justice field for a while, that wasn't public knowledge, even for practitioners. And so it was almost like this hidden thing about people that were and had the right to vote, and they weren't voting. And now you're stepping into that fray and seeing what can be done about it.
Yeah, and I guess weren't voting is an interesting turn of phrase. And I think that's perhaps not the way I would frame it. I think not being given the opportunity to vote is perhaps a better way to put it. So, because there are barriers to access, right? So for folks who are incarcerated, to give you a sense, in Connecticut, you are told that you have to find the address for your town clerk. You've got to write to them and request that they send you an application back in the mail. You then go ahead and fill out that registration application. You send it back. You get a response from them that you then have to go and request by mail an absentee ballot application. You get that back. You send that back. You then get your ballot. You then mail it in. So that's 7 to 8 processes through the mail that no one else in the community has to do. You can go online, you can get your voter form, and these are forms that weren't being provided to folks on the inside. So I think, 4,000 people about each year are eligible to vote from Connecticut jails and prisons. In practice, 20 to 30 people are able to do that. And that's every year. So this year, for the first time, the Department of Corrections has actually shared information with voters. And even then, we found that 40 or 50, maybe 60 folks actually tried to get their ballot. And ultimately, only 20 had been successful because they weren't actually given the forms by the Department of Corrections, and they still had to go through all these hurdles. In a year where the Secretary of State says no one should rely on the mail to vote, everyone has a drop box in their town, no drop boxes for folks at correctional facilities. And so, I think there's a disconnect between, I think DOC and the Secretary of State have said, yeah, we'd love to expand access to the vote. It's a really important thing. And then no steps to sort of connect that higher ideal with actually making it work in practice. So what we've been doing with a bunch of students and some coalition partners who have been working on this, for 4 or 5 years, this is certainly not a newly identified problem, is to identify the 3,400 voters currently incarcerated who were eligible to vote, to send them the information they needed to actually get their ballot access and to get as many of those folks registered in their ballot as possible. So, we're going to collect data on how well we did with that. It seems like already we can see above 200 folks that we were able to help just in the 2 weeks, last 2 weeks when we tried to intervene. And then the goal now is to really see if we can get the Department of Corrections to actually facilitate bringing those ballots back to ballot drop boxes. But I think it's really laid bare some of the issues that folks who are incarcerated in Connecticut face. And ideally, we're looking for a legislative solution that can fix these problems. And I think it sort of highlights, more broadly, some of the issues with elections in Connecticut in general. There's no early voting in Connecticut. There's no excuse absentee voting. You have to vote in a particular town. If you don't, your vote is tossed. I think we can, query how many people are disenfranchised by that system. So a lot of things to think about there, but I think it just goes to show you that even in a state where people's rhetoric is in the right place, there's still so much work to be done to actually realize access.
And I think the value that I've seen is just bringing it to light, because again, it really hadn't been a public conversation until a few years back, and I could just see it kind of taking off exponentially now that you've all been involved and getting students involved, frankly, to go back to the student theme. I do want to bring on Michelle Riordan-Nold now, who's the executive director of the Connecticut Data Collaborative. And her vision for the Connecticut Data is to provide the public with accessible data that informs public decision making. And I know, Michelle, you had a presentation, and what I'd like to say is because of timing that we could make that available to the folks that are attending and put it on the website if that's okay. But maybe you could just walk us through, because Gavin mentioned he didn't want to bring up prison gerrymandering in the film because that's a whole other issue, but at least you can give us a sense of what kind of data you're collecting and what does it tell about who's voting in Connecticut and maybe where they're being counted and the like.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Andrew. So a project that we worked on starting this summer through the fall was to help make voter registration data available to the public in the aggregate to help support the Get Out the Vote efforts. So what we did is we looked at where folks are registered and then compared it to the census population in terms of who's eligible to vote. And so when we did it at the block group level across the state, but what we found is that some, in terms of the towns with the highest number of potential voters who are unregistered, 3 of those towns are towns that have prisons, so Somers, Enfield, and Suffield. So they're showing up as potential eligible voters, but in fact, what's happening is that the census is, counting them in the place of incarceration, not where they're from. So and of course, we've not passed that yet in Connecticut, but it is worth mentioning, right? Because it is going to impact gerrymandering, prison gerrymandering, and in terms of where those folks are counted, but not necessarily represented. So that was one piece of the work, but we also did take a look. You mentioned the youth vote before. We did take a look at folks who are currently registered and who were 18 to 29 in the 2016 election to see what percentage of those folks actually voted. And it was about 47% who were between the ages of 18 and 29 in 2016 who voted in Connecticut. Now those numbers are probably small, lower than actuality, because some of those folks might have not lived in Connecticut, so therefore didn't vote in Connecticut. But it does show, we talked about the youth. I mean, you talked about, being the movement in the 60s was led by youth, and I think we have a huge disenfranchisement of the youth, and it's an area that needs to be worked on, but perhaps changing in present day.
Thank you. And Michelle, can you give us the website for folks to be able to see the voting project?
Yeah, it's ctdata.org/vote.
Great. And so we're getting close to the witching hour here, and I do appreciate everybody who's participated. I just did want to kind of bring it back to the youth, because we are talking about movements. We are talking about what can be done. There's folks that are out there protesting, in particular, many on college campuses, at least until the coronavirus hit. And I'm just wondering, and Gavin and Mr. Dennis, your thoughts on, you've had a lot of conversations across the country, most likely, about your film. What are you sensing? What are the areas where we can motivate folks to be able to get involved, and what are the things that they should be paying attention to?
I don't feel that there's really a lack of motivation. I think we're seeing extreme motivation. I think that the early voting numbers are showing that. I think that people recognize the various kind of, for lack of a better term, emergencies that are facing this democracy. And some of that clearly starts with race. And I think that the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement after the George Floyd murder, and then of course amplified by the various other instances that were brought to light, Breonna Taylor or what have you, is that we're really starting to have that really difficult discussion. And I think that one of the things that I've noticed in this 6+ years of making this movie is that the more you try to suppress the vote, the more motivated people get to actually vote. I mean, we got people standing in line for 10 hours, right? And plus, and they're bringing sandwiches and drinks and lawn chairs, and they're hanging out, and they're wearing masks, and they're social distancing and all this stuff. And I think that it really makes me thrilled to see that. I mean, you'll see in the film, John Fund, who was one of the conservatives who was a large proponent of voter ID, used that almost as an excuse for voter ID. See, we put voter ID in South Carolina and turnout went up, right? And it went up because people were like, hell yeah, I'm gonna vote, right? I think that maybe if they sort of like, they poked the bear, right? If they had left it alone, people might have remained apathetic and stayed home. But as soon as you tell people that they can't do something, or or you scuttle the post office, or you do whatever these sort of brazen techniques are for disenfranchising people, they do get motivated. And I think that I'm really pleased to see it. I love to see the organization around white people and the white community in particular on how to be a good ally and how to advance social justice and racial justice without dominating the conversation. And those kind of things, I think, are happening organically. I don't know that they need, I think there's plenty of avenue for people to express their desire to join these movements. So I don't know that it needs much of a push from me, but I do hope that people do watch the film and kind of learn the historical context of kind of this thread, because I think it does help inform the conversation.
Definitely. And you mentioned there are plenty of things going on, and I just want to mention we will have a resource sheet that will be emailed to everyone later that folks can access through a link Richard will put in the chat, Richard Frieder, and resources to help you learn more, take action, websites, videos, and the like. And Gavin, if you have any to send along, feel free, and we'll put them in there. So Mr. Dennis, you were going to respond. Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired, or are you feeling motivated?
I'm feeling motivated, but I agree with what Gavin said, but I think that we need to get to the core of the problem. And the core of the problem happens to be that 40% of America is supporting the ideas that Trump speaks of. And he's out there representing. It's not about Trump, it's about the 40+%. We need people to begin to go into those communities and begin to have those conversations. How do we get those people to begin to look at these films and have the discussions that's going on in the other percentage of people? So we as Black people can't get in those communities to have those conversations. This is a focus we think we need to have more white people to begin to focus on trying to figure out how to change that culture that's going on invading this country, both in terms of young people, old people, ministers, politicians, what we have. The Senate there is made up of old white men, you know? So how do we get to them or their supporters to begin to change their minds and their culture around this whole issue about systemic racism? They're the ones who are in denial that it exists. And they're the ones who are supporting a system that's promoting this kind of hatred that's going on in this country. So we got to figure out a way how to get to the core, how to cut that out, how to change that culture within that part of the community, society, that's really beginning to invade the homes and the hearts and people, young people, and everybody else, and the American system. And so how do we do that? We got to figure it out. We have a Supreme Court now. That means we got to go back and go with hard work. And if we don't change the culture, you can't depend upon the laws, because that's not going against us at the present time. So that's my suggestion is try to figure out is we need to figure out how to focus on that part of the community and society to make the changes I think necessary for us to be able to move forward.
Yeah. And I know that resonates with me. You know, going back to dinner tables or hanging out with folks back in the communities that I grew up or hang out, there is a contingency that that listens to those dog whistles, and in some ways they're struggling themselves, you know, economically or otherwise. And I think feels kind of compelled to listen to that, and it's maybe the authoritarian nature of it or something else. But I would agree. Any other panelists have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think something that is important to think about now is not just, you know, having hard conversations, changing hearts and minds, getting people out to vote, but also undermining confidence in the electoral system as it exists. I think everything shows us that it's rigged, and yet there's a ton of buy-in for that system. But every single person can arm themselves with the data for their own local community. You can do an information request. You can find out what ballots are counting and why they're not counting. And you can actually spread awareness about how the right to vote is not really what it seems to be. And I think we need that to be a starting place of anger and frustration that causes systematic change. That's not just about using your voice at the ballot box, but also reforming the whole system so that your voice actually is heard once you try to use it. And I think that the general comfort that Americans have with the electoral system as it exists is actually actively undermining our ability to change that system. And, every court case, the Supreme Court is hearing cases right now about how it undermines confidence in the election to have last-minute election challenges that actually vindicate the right to vote for thousands of people whose rights are not being vindicated. That is an idea that needs to be attacked vigorously. And I hope that we can get people's engagement on that piece of it as well, because, I think we may be winning a culture war in many ways, but until the system changes, that's not going to be reflected in the people who are elected in office in this country.
And I have a sense, based on your energy, Zal, you'll be involved in this for a little while. And if people just kind of ride your coattails and figure out how to do it through your guidance, they'll be doing themselves and all of us a favor. So I want to thank everybody for participating tonight. Gavin, Mr. Dennis, Zal, Michelle, a really valuable, informative conversation. I do want to say our next film for the One State, One Film program is going to be on November 24th, and it's based on the film Time. And Time examines the resilience and radical love necessary to prevail over the endless separations of the country's prison industrial complex. And so it'll be a similar format to this. Again, 7 to 8:15. There's a number of things in the chat box that you'll be able to find information. One thing I've learned about Zoom and the time that I've been using it is that you can toggle over to the very right. There's 3 little dots there, and when you go over it, it says more, and you can save the chat. So if there's stuff that you see in there that you want to save, please do that, and you'll have that on your local computer and hard drive and however that works. So I want to thank everybody again for participating. Gavin, Mr. Dennis, you've just been so, your time and sharing with us.
I just want to reiterate that I'm making the film available through Election Day, free and shareable. So I put the link in the chat box. I'll put it again. There it is. So feel free to click on that, share that link as you will. There will be no password needed until November 4th. So for all those of you who may not have seen it, there you go.
Thanks a lot. It's been